Fantastic. All right. Hello, everybody. See, I knew something was up. All right. How's everybody doing today? Okay. So, welcome. So for the final talk, I'll be talking about getting your head out of the cloud and embracing local first apps with Nuxt. So, let's kick it off, shall we? So I always like to start talks with a little fun fact. So for me, I am a big fan of amusement parks, and this is one of my favorite rides, the Jurassic Park River Adventure from Universal Studios. And if you can't find me up here in the photo, you see I'm all the way up here in the upper right. I'm the guy with two hands up in the air because it's an 80-foot drop, pretty big one, but lots of fun. And so if you ever get a chance, be sure to check it out. But fun fact aside, so as Jen mentioned, so my name is Ben Hong. I'm a staff developer experience engineer. I love helping to make the web like a fun place to build things. So Vue core team, Nuxt ambassador, but I also do work with the Angular team too. I'm currently helping them with the docs, and just happy to be part of open source and the whole narrative around that. If you're looking for me on the Internet of Things, you can find me under the moniker Ben Code Zen. I think I own most of the properties on that. So whether you're looking for me on YouTube, Blue Sky, whatnot, you can find me under that. All right, so let's start by setting the stage, shall we? On the fact that we live in this incredible age right now where we have technology, computing devices, and we're connected to the internet, and it's phenomenal, right? It seems like everything is perfect. Now, all this to be said, this is what ultimately was the selling point of this concept of cloud computing, right? Because we have this ability to have all our devices connected to this magical cloud and our data, and it stores all our data, and we never have to worry about anything, right? Well, except when the cloud completely fails us. So whether that's traveling on a train that has spotty signal, or frankly, you're sitting at the coffee shop with weak Wi-Fi, or also known as Li-Fi. And it's really frustrating when the apps that we rely on for our critical infrastructure basically keeps us out of reach from our work. Say, I don't know, let's say, for example, you have a big presentation and you have all your notes in this app that only works when it's online, except, oh, sorry, the time you need it, the servers are offline. And so you've lost also some of your data before your big presentation. And, don't ask me how I know. Not that I haven't been there before. And no, I'm not bitter at all that software hasn't done that to me before. So, you end up in this position where you're just like, I don't know, I pay all this money to like keep my data safe and to have it ready to go. Yet for some reason, like, why does it feel like I don't have any control when it comes to this stuff? And so at the end of the day, though, there's this great little sticker that I absolutely love. And it's this reminder that there really is no cloud. It's really just someone else's computer, right? Because that was ultimately the selling point of cloud, was that you never had to worry about servers anymore, right? Someone else dealt with it. But that also meant you gave up the control of what was happening to your data and basically server uptime and all those things. And God forbid that the app that you're using that's part of your critical infrastructure is getting acquired, right, by, I don't know, a big company, say cough cough Huli or whatnot. And then hooray to all the employees who made a lot of money, but kind of a sad day for users, because typically, as we well know, acquisitions usually mean the services are getting shut down or they're getting integrated, which means users are sort of left to fend for themselves as far as painful migrations, or as most of us have experience with note-taking apps and other things like that before, we essentially declare tooling bankruptcy and we just start over. And I think that's a pretty sad place for us to be sort of in this modern world of tech. And so, to paraphrase the words of the great Obi-Wan Kenobi, like, there was this whole concept with cloud computing, especially when it was introduced, and everyone was so excited that it was supposed to be the chosen one, right? It was said that it would unite all the apps and not divide them. Yet, more and more as we see apps that are so cloud-centric around their data model, around subscriptions, like, I think people have a fatigue regarding all these subscriptions and their data being split up in multiple places and then having to deal with proprietary data formats. Like, it's exhausting. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, I mean, as a user, it feels like we don't have any control. And then, so in case people can't see the meme up top, there's the keyboard and the control key is missing. So that's what's up there. Now, of course, fear not, though. This is not a talk to sit here and talk about all the ways that clouds has failed me. No, I'm not bitter. We are here to talk about local first, right? That there is actually an answer to some of these frustrations that I'm sure many of us have dealt with when it comes to Working with cloud. All right, so let's start by setting the tone, shall we? What exactly is local first? Basically, so this is a definition from a very popular blog post by Ink and Switch. And so it reads, basically local first software includes the ability to work offline and collaborate across multiple devices while also improving the security, privacy, long-term preservation, and user control of data. Now that is a mouthful, right? So I want to focus on two specific things. In that local first software is about the ability to work offline, and two, the ability to collaborate across multiple devices. And so a lot of times when people hear local first, the reason I want to clarify this is because they think that it means local only, meaning that we're only talking about storing data locally and then you don't have the ability for multiplayer and that kind of stuff. Local first is essentially a move towards a more hybrid approach where we do want to take the benefits of cloud, right? It's not that cloud doesn't have its advantages, but the idea that we've sort of given up so much control, especially on the data front, to the cloud when we have these incredibly powerful devices that we often pay lots of money for in terms of storage and hard drive, why we can't find a bridge between those two and find a sort of a happy medium. So for those who have been in the tech industry a bit, as we well know, what's old becomes new again. And so let's take a little trip down memory lane. And for those who don't have much memory with this, to explain here, here we have a Microsoft Office Home and Student 2007 license, a box basically that you purchased for like, say, I think it was like $200-300. But the great thing was you got all these CDs with the license key, and as long as you popped it in, installed it, that worked. You owned it. Same thing for Adobe Photoshop, right? You paid a one-time license fee, and then as long as you were okay with the fact that you were on CS 6.0, you were good to go. And gosh, let's not forget a throwback to the N64 days of Super Smash Bros. Here we have a cartridge. You bought the game for $40. You plug it in. It works. It's fantastic. We've kind of lost sight of that, right? For a lot of our software these days, because for a lot of, especially these cloud-centric services, internet is not optional. But local first is wanting to push that, right? Because, I mean, let's take, for example, any gamers here, if you know, we are dealing with a sort of controversial thing regarding who owns the games that we purchase, especially when it comes to digital licenses. And so now when you purchase games, you have to download tons of gigs of data. And then on top of that, if the server happens to be offline, good luck with playing the game that you want to play, let alone if they have some sort of weird thing where they've expired your license. Like there's no ownership anymore. What happened to that sort of feeling? And then on top of that, right, with all the subscription models and the payment, it makes things incredibly complicated for users because a lot of times, most people, especially with things like, with Adobe Photoshop, that kind of stuff, most of the people just have very basic needs, and paying the one-time $200-300 fee to have a perpetual license makes a lot more sense to them than some subscription fee, which, don't get me wrong, makes a lot of sense for professionals who want to be up to date with the latest and greatest. But if you have a machine that can run the software that solves your problem, shouldn't that be good enough? And so, yeah, to harken back, like this is what made this era of software so great was that this is what you got when you purchased it, and you got to keep it and reuse it across devices as you saw fit. And so local first then also purport this idea that apps work forever, because in the instances we talked about earlier regarding software where you're essentially cloud-centric dependent and you don't own the data, the moment the apps go away, like you're basically out of luck, or the apps shut down and whatnot. So we want to move back to that point where we can own the software truly as users. And then here is a little riff on the Halloween candy meme. If you hadn't seen, it reads, parents, please check your kids' Halloween candy. There have been reports of random AI features that no one has ever asked for. And so, a lot of times, in terms of what we're talking about here, a lot of times with this software, we have now this issue where we have trusted so many companies with our data in the cloud. And now because, well, let's face it, no one ever reads the terms of agreements whenever we're clicking that thing. Like a lot of our data is being opted into training models and that kind of stuff that honestly, if we had known from the beginning, might have actually opted out of. And so without naming any platforms, like a lot of them even have the point where you're automatically opted into the training of language models, and you actually have to explicitly opt out rather than what you would think would be the more, let's call it the ethical way, which is you opt into the model training. And so a little throwback to the Microsoft Office days, for those who remember, that's Clippy, the office assistant. And so it's a little joke on, it sounds like you're trying to reconsider my legacy. Would you like some help? and sort of harkening back to how chatbots now are kind of being injected on sort of every product that we see these days. Okay, so this brings us to a couple of other things why local first is becoming more and more important as a software trend. In that, when you have data that's local first and for your users to own and keep on their devices, then you get security and privacy by default. Because this means that it will work offline, basically on the device without needing an internet connection. And more importantly, at the end of the day, with all of this in mind, your user gets to retain ultimate control. And that, I think, is really powerful when we think about how software impacts local communities. And the fact that a lot of the software we talk about these days are designed around enterprise companies, which is nothing wrong with it. But there's a kind of a forgotten market, I think, with the indie hackers and helping to solve problems that communities are having that might not justify the large scale that like a lot of enterprise solutions often ask for. And so local first is this really great movement, and one of the reasons why I'm here talking to you about it today. Now, of course, if you're wondering for some examples of great apps that are doing this local first example, I'm a huge fan of Obsidian. It's a markdown note-taking app. If you ever have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I will nerd out about Obsidian with you all day long. And so highly recommend checking that out. Basically, it keeps all your markdown files locally on your computer in your hard drive, and that's what they are. They're just text files. They're not proprietary data formats, and it lets you modify and do fun stuff and automate. And it's a phenomenal piece of tooling. And the great thing about Obsidian is that once you download it and it works with your notes, you don't ever have to download and update again. It just works. And so shout out to them on that. And Linear, for those who don't know, is a sort of like a project management issue tracking app. And they have a similar principle as well, where everything works offline, and then it will sync to like GitHub or whatever project issue tracking software you're using. But both of these are sort of like proponents of and like solid examples of this concept of local first. Now, of course, all this said and done, now we've done a little bit primer on local first and its benefits. The real question here is obviously, how do I build for local first? And if you're jumping into this, there's actually quite a few libraries and stuff. Can be a little bit overwhelming. And so here we have a bunch of different logos from Dexy.js on the upper left to like YJS, CouchDB. We got a lot going on here. And so it can be a bit to filter through, but we're here at Nuxt Nation. So of course, the really big question is, how do we do this with Nuxt? And that's what we'll be talking about. And so we're going to cherry pick a couple of these technologies today. And we're going to talk about Nuxt with Dexy.js, which is basically a thin wrapper, a minimalist wrapper around IndexedDB. And then RxDB, which basically helps to provide the syncing and caching that will make the experience of working with a backend feel pretty intuitive and, more importantly, show some pretty cool stuff. All right. So with that, for those wondering, everything that I'm showing today will be is already up on GitHub. So it's under my moniker bencodezen/local first Nuxt to do MVC. And so yeah, let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at some code, shall we? Okay. First thing first, let's walk through the code. All right, so here's a demo of the app that you have here. Basically, as you can see here right now, it's deployed the app at netlify.com, and we have this little hash here that is important, and we'll get back to you in just a bit. So we have here a really standard to do MVC, and you're probably thinking, what's so interesting about this, right? We got the ability to clear. We can go ahead and shift between the different filters. This is great. And so what's interesting, though, about this is that we are now entering sort of a realm where, one, all of the data is offline. So as you can see, if I go ahead and work on this and I say, let's get ramen for lunch, right? That's added. And if I refresh, because it's using IndexedDB at the bottom, don't worry, we'll look at code later. Everything is basically, the session is stationary. It's been saved. But what's particularly cool, though, is that this app also uses peer-to-peer technology in order to allow for sessions. So if we go ahead and I have this open now in Safari here on the right here, you'll see here that right now we have both apps open, and then I say, never mind, I'd like to get burgers. You see that both sides populate at the same time. And what's really cool about this is using WebRTC and peer-to-peer basically communication in order to send data, basically having this sort of multiplayer impact. But here's the cool part about this. There's no middle person. There's no server in between. And what's cool about this is if we take this offline, this app will still work on its own and it'll still do its thing. And so, so if you want to play around with this, you can go ahead and go to this URL right now. Again, the hashtag for now, we're going to use room-nux-nation-2024. Because this is being recorded, I'm going to go ahead and close these particular URLs because I'm sure we have a couple of pranksters inside of the audience. And for the sake of ensuring we keep this PG for the kids, in case anyone's watching, I'm going to close these. But you can all see then. You can go ahead and play around and click around, and it should basically work. Okay, so that being said, we're going to go ahead and take a look at what's happening underneath the hood. So let me go ahead and now switch over to localhost 3000, and then boom, there we go. We have the local instance up and running. Let me put that over to the side. Let's bring this over 2/3. And so what we have here is a standard Nuxt 3 app. Nothing complicated. The main thing here, though, that makes this different from the apps is that we're utilizing basically the RxDB database as a composable. But then otherwise, what we're going through, you can see here that we have a very standard sort of SQL, NoSQL-like query where you're going through the database, you're getting the retrieved, and then basically once you get that response, you're just assigning it to a reactive value like we typically would. As you can see here, to-do list is a ref. And then inside of here, everything else is really standard Vue Nuxt. And so let's go ahead and dive into what makes this a bit different. And so inside of our used database, composable, you'll see here that we had a lot of different imports coming in, but so we'll skip on down inside of here to kind of explain what's going on. So we have essentially your singleton pattern that has a database promise, which allows us to basically call on the same database so that you don't instantiate multiple ones, especially when you're going through different components, you might need to call different database functionality. And so that's why this, you can see here, this is being instantiated out here. And then we have the used database composable, which is going inside and then basically going through all the motions as far as like initializing a database of IndexedDB storage with Dexy.js. And then there's a bunch of things going on here. But one of the things that's really cool here is that we can see here, this is the part of the code that's showing you how the room ID hash is working in terms of like it's generating it, populating it inside the URL. And then this is what's allowing us to essentially create unique database instances that allow us to basically see different instances. So for example, if we take a look at here, right now we have, let me just make this easier. This is room 123, and 123 will have some numbers inside of here, 456, 789. This is great. And then here, if I switch the hash again to, let's say, 456, you'll see here that it's basically gone, right? It's essentially a new instance of the app. And we go back to 123. And then, oh, it looks like this one, of course, live demos. But anyways, so it typically saves the cache of the individual database instances. Okay, so I'll debug that another time. But, okay. And then finally, one of the things when it comes to local first that most people don't realize is that one of the core technologies that's basically being worked on as an industry is around this idea of sync engines, because what we have to do is figure out how we actually coordinate the UI changes that you're making on the front end with the back end in a way that doesn't basically override each other with conflicts. Because if anyone has ever tried to write one of these before, you'll know that especially when it comes to multiplayer aspects, it's easy to think that when player 1 makes a change and then player 2 makes a change, all you need to compare is the last modified date. But it's more complicated than that because a lot of times within your backend service, as things are being updated and saved, these are being run in parallel to the various actions that users are taking. So you really need a way to sequentialize it in a way that ensures that you have a serialization of the data that makes sense rather than having sort of these race conditions where updates are being happened and then are happening on the back end that don't make sense and don't correspond to the front end. And so as you can see here, again, we won't dive into the nitty gritty as far as like defining schemas and stuff. But the key here to try to illustrate here is that what Local First is trying to do is make it a lot easier, especially as web developers, for us to build a lot of the front end piece of it. And then it takes care of that magic when it comes to all the rest of it. Because some of the things that sync engines also do, for example, is that you can imagine that if you want all your data to run locally first, that can be really expensive if you're downloading all of your data all at once, especially if you're dealing with gigs and gigs of, let's say, notes and images and that kind of stuff. And you have all these reference points. But then also, the issue here is that what happens when you want to deal with performance issues regarding like things that are recently done. And so the sync engine is basically responsible for not only ensuring that basically recent data is being kept up to date, but then also strategies regarding how to best optimize for those performance edge cases regarding like how much of the cache to save versus what's being recently accessed. And all that logic is being taken care of by sync engines such as, so in this case, we're using RxDB. But another one that I want to shout out to is Replicache. And they're doing some incredible work regarding helping to essentially create these sort of zero latency UIs that make it feel like, again, it's seamless, like your front end works with the back end exactly as you want. And it's dealing with all that sync stuff that you don't even have to think about. And as a result, your users just get this phenomenal user experience where it feels like your app is so snappy and the data is somehow saving to the back end. But guess what? All that's being done with this movement of local first. And so for those who really want to be on the cutting edge, Zero Sync Dev is the one I am personally really excited for. And this is essentially the evolution of Replicache. And they're basically, as you can see here, let me bump this up a bit so it's easier to see. Their idea here is that you can take your web app, and then with some SQL queries, it will automatically manage all like the WebSockets to zero cache, and then to replication across whatever clusters of database you're using. And then it just works. And then we get to do all the fun stuff regarding building the UI and creating really complex interactions, rather than having to worry about the sort of constant management of like API calls and then what do we do with the cache data and stuff. Like these problems are for the most part universal and I think should be solved at a way that is abstracted at this level. And so sync engines like this, I think, are a really big thing. And so it's funny because when I'd be on panels in the past, people would always ask like, what do you think is the next big thing when it comes to web development? Like at this point, my big thing, like if I'm betting anything on trends, it is local first, because there's just such an exciting premise regarding this idea that like we're moving further along this idea of giving users back the control of their data, but more importantly, making developers' lives way more fun as far as like being able to build these bespoke software solutions that might only make sense for a small amount of their community, but they don't have to spin up like a huge cluster of enterprise services just to make that happen, right? So anyways, that said, yes, okay, so we talked about that. Oh, yes, a couple other things. When you're walking through this in the future, if you look, you'll notice here that there is a process polyfill here, which looks kind of random, but this is part of the WebRTC plugin that's being used for RxDB. So that's what this is. I should probably add a comment in there so people can see, but this is not completely random, and must exist for things to work as is at the moment. Okay, so that said, all right, let's jump back into some slides. All right, so the final tech stack for what you saw here with the Nuxt To Do MVC is essentially Nuxt 3. We have Dexy.js, once again, for IndexedDB. RxDB, which is essentially doing all the syncing regarding the database with making sure everything's talking to each other. And then the final piece of it is the WebRTC, which you can take a look at as far as how that works. And that's what allows what we saw regarding the peer-to-peer connection for data and sharing that. Okay, so with that said, as far as some of the closing thoughts that I want to go over, the thing is that if we try to imagine a future without this sort of local first trend towards software, might look something like this. And in fact, for those in case you can't see the slides, we have, I think it's Spamly from Wreck-It Ralph breaks the internet. So he has an ad, want to get rich playing video games. And we got, the usual like and subscribe that we're all very familiar with on YouTube. And with a lot of these enterprise and especially software that is geared towards monetization in a way where virality and that kind of stuff is the name of the game, I think we lose out on a lot of what makes software so much fun to build for. Because oftentimes, again, I've hearkened to this a few times during this talk, but like one of the best things about, I think, in the early days before all of this, like sort of the monetary incentives came into play, was that software was really a way to automate things that helped our communities solve problems. And local first really is about that movement back towards that. And so, again, so to this point, like it is about giving users ownership over both their data and their tooling once again, and really does incentivize developers to build in this way, because not only is this a good user experience, honestly, as a whole for enterprise users as well, because there's nothing more frustrating than hearing like a user complain that because they didn't have internet, they couldn't use your software. But the fact that, right, okay. The fact that we're able to let users actually use the device that, again, that they purchase, right? You know, when we look at the hardware upgrades that we purchase on laptops, on phones for more storage, like we should be storing our data. That's the whole purpose of it. And for us to have ownership of that, that would, what a world to be, what a world it would be if we could return back to that and make progress towards that. So of course, again, this talk is really just a primer as far as local first. There's so much to go into regarding this. And again, if we had like a half a day of workshop, we would dive into all the nitty gritty. But I wanted to leave you with some resources regarding ways you can sort of get involved with the local first movement. And so the first of which is local first software. You own your data in spite of the cloud. This is probably one of the seminal blog posts that came out back in 2019. If you want to take a look at some of their findings regarding local first prototypes and some of the challenges that they encountered and how they solved it. And then there was also, I believe, the very first local first conference. And so this talk by Martin Kleppmann, the past, present, and future of local first, is a phenomenal primer on, as exactly as that sounds, the history and kind of where local first is going as an industry. And then one of my favorite talks of the year is by Maggie Appleton, and it's from the same conference, but it's about home-cooked software and barefoot programmers. If you're, honestly, if you're feeling a little burnt out or you're looking for inspiration of like what got you into this, you know, industry as far as, you know, the fun and joy of coding, Maggie does a wonderful job sort of illustrating this concept and what this really means, especially in the age of AI, LLMs. Like, what does this mean for this concept of barefoot programmers, which I'd love to get into. But again, if you have time for any talk, highly recommend checking hers out. She's phenomenal. And then finally, if you're looking for a community to join, of course, there's the localfirstweb.dev, and then they have a Discord community and they have a meetup, I believe. So, you know, check them out if you're looking for like-minded individuals who want to push this movement forward. And finally, as far as shipping stuff to users, I do want to give a shout out, you know, because again, there's only so many things we can talk about in this time's talk slot. But Nuxt also works really well with Electron, and a big shout out to Tori. They just had their 2.0 release, I believe, a month ago. I think it's been at this point. So that is a phenomenal partnership as well. If you want to check out, that's a Rust-based, basically a desktop mobile app packager. You can use Nuxt Vue to build your app, and then these libraries will basically help you package it and ship them out. And so definitely check them out if that's something you've been itching to do. And so I guess as the final send off, this is a reminder that you have the power, right? Like we as developers, a lot of times, you know, I know that we don't have the ability to influence a lot of decisions at the leadership level regarding what they're choosing. But I think if more of us can push local first inside of our companies and this concept, I think we're going to see a much better user experience happening across the board for software as an industry. So yeah, I think with that, I know we were running over this
we have
talk,
questions.
So hopefully, thanks everyone for listening. And again, you can find me on the moniker Ben Codezen. Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful. We have questions.
Yay, questions. Let's do it.
All right. Is use database a composable that can be used with any kind of database?
Yeah. So the use database I did was just a generic one, and so. Yeah. So basically the answer is yes. You can configure whatever you want to it. It's just returning the database instance, and it doesn't have to be RxDB.
Cool. Is there any way to write a Nuxt sync engine that would deal with live sync with a database like Supabase and leverage their real-time API?
It's funny you should ask that. I definitely thought about that. I think my original approach when I was going with this talk was trying to do like a whole bespoke Nitro plugin to like make all of that work. But I think I mentioned this in my talk, but one of the challenges with sync engines is that you're almost making a product in and of itself besides the database and the front end, because there are a lot of decisions to be made regarding how caching is purged or saved, because caching is normally typically something you purge, but in something like a local first software, a lot of times cache actually stays around pretty permanently. So then you have to figure out a strategy for managing that. But is it possible? Absolutely it is. And so that's why I recommend, if that's something you're interested in, definitely start looking into like the local first community seems to be very open about the challenges that they've been encountering and solving. So be sure to check out those resources to kind of see what architectural challenges and performance bottlenecks they've dealt with that if you'd like to build it. And yeah, happy to look into it if you do build it.
Yay. All right. Are these features fully compatible with changing deployment target platforms like using Electron?
Yeah, that's what's actually one of the most exciting things I think about local first, the movement, is that they're not looking to append the entire software industry as far as how we build things. In fact, I think whoever came up with the word sync engine, I absolutely love. It's this piece that you just kind of drop in the middle between your front end and the back end, and it just does the magic for you. And so, like I said, you can look at the code on GitHub earlier, but again, I very little of that was customized. It was just I told RxDB like, hey, I want to save my data to this, and then use the P2 like the peer-to-peer art WebRTC extension. And then it just worked. Like I focused primarily on making sure the front end was wired up correctly. Like that's what makes I think local first really fun, and I think will make even easier for developers going forward. So it's super exciting.
Fantastic. Thank you. And more RxDB questions. What role did RxDB play in this demo? Is there any data being stored on their cloud, or is it all data being stored in our browsers and they simply serve as a connection sync pipeline between them?
Good question. So it's essentially the second one where there is no RxDB cloud. It's just responsible for basically, so the data storage is the Dexy.js that I was mentioning. It's actually using your browser storage IndexedDB to store all the data, and RxDB is responsible for the real-time sync regarding the IndexedDB sessions, and then in combination with the WebRTC plugin that we have, making sure those are talking to each other and working correctly. And so again, to the person who came up with Sync Engine, just perfect name. That's essentially all RxDB is doing.
Okay. When data is synced across devices, do all devices then store the latest copy of the data, or is it merged in, is it a merged data set?
Great question. So this is actually another one of the challenges that local first has, is that when you have a user go offline for a long time, what do, right? And they made all these changes. And so basically it's the second where it's a merged data set, and sync engines are designed to also be basically have intelligent decision points regarding when to choose thing and not merely just the last modified point. Because just for a little bit of nerding out, the issue with the last modified comparison point is that if you as a user modify the data and then it goes to the server and the server makes a modification of that data and then it pushes that data back to your server to say that it made a modification, then your server then says that, oh, I made it, like there's a new update, and this is basically this infinite loop. And so because of that, sync engines help to take away that the business logic that ends up dealing with the merge conflicts, and it makes it a lot easier. So hopefully that
Nice.
helps answer the
Thank
question.
you.
Yeah.
All right. What are the limitations for the local first? Because as far as I know, there are some limitations on browsers for storage, etc.
Yeah, so I think the main limitation for local first at this point will most likely be, in my mind, performance. So for example, Obsidian, so it's not storing your text files on an IndexedDB. It's actually reading your local file system and reading like individual markdown files, and then it's intelligently caching. Like it's phenomenal what the Obsidian team has done. If you ever get a chance to try it and check it out. But basically, we're trying to figure out, or the local first community, to be honest, is trying to figure out ways to handle large data sets, and how to basically merge those things. And so that's really where I think it's fun, because if you ever wanted to be on the forefront of like a trend, I think this is the one to hop on, and there's a lot of room for having impact as far as how things go moving forward.
Nice. And last question. Is there a good spot to access local first community resources you mentioned near the end?
Oh, that's a great point. I'll make sure to go ahead and like on the social media share all my slides. But then I'll make sure also in that GitHub repository that in the README, I'll drop all those resources as well.
And
So
those
yeah,
are how to reach out to them.
yes, exactly. All the Ben codes and things. So
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining us today.
yeah, thanks everyone for having me.